Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Holloway. I'm on the faculty at the School of International and Public Affairs, and I am the director of the Masters in Nonprofit Management at the School of Professional Studies. On behalf of our programs and the Climate School, I'm thrilled to welcome you to a fireside chat between Gary White, Water.org, and Water Equity co-founder and CEO, and SEPA student Alice Lassman, who has a background in both the private sector, the nonprofit sector, and has worked in design, and recently on a design challenge focused on SDG 6, which is ensuring water access and sanitation for all. Clearly, we've assembled two of the experts on water and the water crisis and creative minds around it. And Alice and Gary are going to talk this afternoon with you on the water crisis, water equity, and solvable solutions, as discussed in Gary's new book that he co-authored with Matt Damon, someone you've probably heard of, called The Worth of Water. And so I'd ask Alice and Gary to come to the stage. And while I do that, just want to thank a few people in the room. One, Mary Stone, who's the new president of the Nonprofit Student Association. Lonnie, Ryan, Liz Picard, who helped put this event together. Idan, where is Idan? Idan Sela. Thank you all so much, and look forward to our discussion, and we will follow up with Q&A in about 30 minutes. Thanks so much.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. I feel like it's only fitting to start this talk with Gary pouring the water. So thank you, Gary. Appreciate
You're welcome.
it. Lovely to have you here. Is this your first time on campus?
No, I was here a few years ago
Okay.
doing something with Jeff Sachs at that time.
Yeah, I've
I
heard
can't
of him.
remember what it was, but it was, yeah, I didn't get to see, it was at night, so that's my first ability to take in the campus. It's beautiful.
I see. Well, good job the windows are all open, just for you to have a look at the full campus. Great. So I'm just going to start with a sort of general question. You mentioned in your book that you find speeches nerve-wracking. So there must be an urgency to this book. So why now?
Did I find speaking nerve-wracking? Yes. So for me, it is. It depends on the context, right? So I feel like when I'm in my element and I can talk about water and sanitation and kind of my passion for this, it's a lot easier. And it also gets much easier if I have a really accommodating interviewer.
It's very helpful. So why don't you start by telling us a little bit more about water.org?
Sure. So it's, for me, ever since I was an undergrad in university actually studying engineering, it was a passion of mine to try to find the intersection between engineering and social justice. And when you try to look at the intersection of those two, water and sanitation around the world kind of jumps right to the top of the list. And so for me, water.org is basically the response to that, to try to, as an engineer initially, to figure out how do you help people around the world get access to improved water supplies and sanitation. And that has been a long journey for me. This was, back in 1990 when, I co-founded the organization. And the idea was to figure out ways to improve upon what was happening already with water and sanitation. I don't know, I guess you guys may know, this is UN Water Week, right? This is the first time the UN has had a conference focused on water since 1977. And that was the start of what that conference kicked off the water decade, which was the 1980s. And the goal of the 1980s was that everyone in the world would have water and sanitation by 1990. So fast forward to today, and there's still 771 million people without water, more than 1 billion people without improved sanitation. And so this is why water.org exists, to attack this crisis, to have the vision when everybody can have safe drinking water and sanitation, but to always be doing it in ways that are more entrepreneurial, more innovative, so that we can, not be too encumbered by conventional wisdom. And we'll talk, I'm sure, a little bit about some of the solutions and why they're different than what we were when we started, which was kind of like another water NGO that was out there raising charity, kind of doing community water projects, drilling wells, and then kind of moving on. And while there's a lot of need for that, it also is not going to solve the crisis for billions of people.
Precisely. And I think, Gary, also you mentioned this in the book at length at the beginning. You actually read my mind perfectly with the next question, which is, why do you think that the water crisis wasn't solved during the water decade? Because that was what was pitched.
Yeah. Basically lack of resources. When you think about water and sanitation, and you look at where we are, I mean, here in New York, here in the United States, in Europe, we solved this problem more than 100 years ago, right? It's not a big mystery as to how do you source water and treat it and distribute it. Imagine if, we found the cure for cancer, and 100 years later there were still millions of people dying from cancer. That's kind of what we have with the situation. So what was it? It's really the lack of will and lack of resources. And I think that's changing. It's evolving. I think that what we see in low-income countries is there's a lot of competition for the budgets there. And so the resources are not being allocated to it from the countries. Kind of the bilateral and multilateral aid and development finance institutions are kind of covering some of the gap, but it's still not even close to what's needed to solve for this. And so what we have now is kind of an awakening, and I've seen that this past week with the UN Water Conference. Before, it was all about water being the purview only of those aid agencies or the multilaterals and local governments, and that's why the decade failed in the 1980s. There just wasn't enough resources. Now what we have are new people coming into the scene, right? More foundations, more corporations actually, who want to have water sustainability and are concerned about their water footprint. They're concerned about sustainability. And so you see them coming to the fore even more. You see climate driving water access now. So there's a lot in climate that's to dealing with mitigation. And there are some things in the water sector that can help with mitigation, but it's much more about adaptation. And so now there is more capital flowing in through some of the Green Climate Fund initiatives and others that can help with access and adaptation. So that's helping. And then putting the spotlight on private finance to come into this as well. And so what we see is a potential with some of our initiatives to really tap into the capital markets in a way that will allow us to complement philanthropy with social impact investing. So using the capital markets to kind of bend that force towards the poor, and using us as kind of an intermediary that makes sure that as the poor tap into small loans, that it's done equitably and sustainably from their perspective as well. So I have a lot of hope that this isn't going to be a do-over of the water decade, that we can make real progress by bringing these new forces together. And I think that's kind of what water.org has always been about, trying to find our way through the zeitgeist, the forces that are out there, and bend them towards what we're trying to do, whether it be bending microfinance towards water and sanitation, or bending social impact investing towards this, or bending climate dollars towards this. We're kind of there as advocates of people living in poverty to make sure that these forces, as they often have throughout history, completely bypass the poor, to be advocates for them.
Mm. I love that you mentioned there are a few things within that, like venture philanthropy. You mentioned microfinancing, and we'll come to a lot of that later in terms of the kind of broader innovation and entrepreneurship space. One thing that I found fascinating in the book is that essentially we already spend enough money to fix the water crisis. And there's a stat that you use, which is 114 billion a year is required for 10 years to fix the water crisis. But the fact that coping costs themselves already amount to 300 billion means that we're already exceeding by over double the amount that could be spent on fixing the water crisis at its source, if you'll excuse the pun, rather than fixing the problems that come about from the water crisis. So what does that mean for us?
Well, it's a sad statement, right? That those costs that are borne by primarily the world's poor, what we call coping costs. So when everybody in the world who woke up today got water somewhere, right? That's just a given. The question is, how much time did they have to spend finding that water? A lot of people will walk, miles every day or spend hours waiting in queues. The next question is, how much money did they pay? Because a lot of people in urban areas really don't have any water sources to walk to. And so they are spending money to get water, sometimes from these informal vendors who have, sell water off the back of a truck, big tank, and it's not quality water. And so what we see is they are spending money and time. And then there's the health cost. If you are sick from water-related disease, you're not able to work, so you lose time there. Girls aren't in school, so they are losing out for their whole future because they're spending that time collecting. So if you add up all these costs, these coping costs, it does come out to about $300 billion a year. The problem is those are all dispersed and disseminated and here and there. It's all money that's sloshing around in this big water system. But to try to capture that and funnel it back into the 140 trillion or a billion that's needed, that is kind of what we're trying to do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what with our water credit program. A woman who may have been paying, this is a woman I met actually, her name was Lisa in the Philippines. She was spending $60 a month for one of these water vendor trucks to have water for her house. That's the only option she really had. So she was able to then take out a small loan with one of our financial partners in the Philippines, about $300, and then she got a water connection to the public utility. Until she could get that connection, she couldn't get that connection until she had the capital up front. So she could pay $2 a day to the water vendor, but she didn't have $300 to pay to connect. But then once she got that loan, she connected. Her loan payments were about $5 a month, and her water bill now is $5 a month. So right there, she gained back $50 every month in her coping costs, right? So you multiply that by millions of people, and you can see how those two numbers reconcile and why the coping cost really overcharge for what needs to be happening to fix the problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that particular concept is something that probably resonates with a lot of people in this audience, about the idea that we're sort of solving crises as and when they come about, as opposed to the root cause of them. Just to move a little bit more into sort of the microfinance aspect, I know this is something that water.org was really pivoted into. Could we understand as an audience a little bit more about how you see this as the new paradigm of how we think about the water crisis?
Yeah, this is, I think, an example of kind of bending a force that's already out there towards what you're doing. And I, have been doing this for quite a while, and a lot of my insights and aha moments come from just being in communities, talking to people who live, in what we call water poverty. And I'm almost always talking to women about this because it affects them the most. They're the ones that are walking to collect water, and they're the ones that are most focused on their children's health. And to see what they are experiencing is what kind of gives you the insight to solving the problem. And so, one woman I met in particular that kind of pointed in the direction of why we should look at water credit was this elderly woman. She was in India, I think it was in Bangalore, and I was talking to her because she had a toilet at her home. And I asked her, how she built the toilet, where did she get the money to do that? And she said she went to a loan shark. She called it a money lender, but it's a loan shark. And I asked her how much she was paying for that loan, and did the math, and she was paying 125% interest to this loan shark, because she wanted that toilet so bad for her. She was elderly. Before that, she had to wait until the cover of night to kind of walk down this hillside and go find a place along the river to defecate. And so for her, it was worth it to do that. But it's like, well, what if we could help people like that get access to more affordable financing? So the idea was to go to microfinance institutions and say, hey guys, this is like a loan product for you. And I started doing that probably 20 years ago in different countries, and knocking on the doors of these MFIs and telling them, hey, this could be a really great thing to do, loan for water, loan for toilets. And they're like, no way, right? We don't all we loan for are businesses. I want to see a woman who's buying a sewing machine or buying a cow, and she can show me how she's going to have cash flow, by the end of the week. And there's no way we're going to lend for water and toilets. It doesn't work. But we had that insight that knew about the coping cost, right? So it's like, well, what if we de-risk this for microfinance institutions? What if we take the risk instead of them and say, here's, a pool of capital that you can draw against, or here's some training, some technical assistance that we can help you kind of beef up your knowledge about lending for water and sanitation. And that was kind of the breakthrough. So then once we got some of those microfinance institutions to kind of take that risk with us, because we didn't want to become a bank. We didn't want to start being the people who went around the world and made $300 loans. It just didn't seem right or feasible. And so we really worked hard to work through that existing force and move it. And so that's kind of what we did. And now you kind of fast forward now, and about 52 million people have gotten access to water and sanitation, not through charity, but through these loans, and that equals about $4.2 billion in capital that has churned through the system now as these microloans and been repaid. And by the way, the women repay these loans north of 97%. So this isn't like necessarily that high risk of a loan once you get to it. And what we hear from our partners too is the financial partners see this as being very positive, because if you have improved water and you're not as sick as often, you're going to repay your loan for your sewing machine as well, or your cow, right? So there's this mutually reinforcing aspect of this.
Exactly. What's actually so fascinating about what you just mentioned is that the fact that water and sanitation and making sure that there's equitable access for all in that sense doesn't take as much priority as investing in businesses, but the fact that it's actually de-risking your investment in business by making sure that people stay healthy and well sanitized. I'm going to move on to one thing that you mentioned a little bit earlier about other cross-cutting issues, which is sort of why is water so important? And I'm just going to kind of reel off a stat here, which is that it is a very gendered issue. You mentioned earlier that there's a time, there's a broader cost and opportunity cost that you mentioned around the process of collecting water. But I have a stat which is that 73.5% of people who collect water are women, and only 16.6% of men. Notice that there is a gap there from the 100%, and the remainder of those people are children.
Yeah.
So what actually is the opportunity cost in terms of other issues there? Things like gender, education. How are you seeing that issue play out in practice?
Yeah, for sure. I think it does fall on the shoulders of women and girls disproportionately, as the statistics point out. And I think that it just robs people of their future, right? I mean, there's the current cost today of being sick, and not being able to go to school, or you're carrying water, so you can't go to school, or for women, you can't work at a paying job, or if you have a job, you might lose it because every day you don't know if you're going to a public stand post in a slum, you don't know if you're going to be waiting for an hour or 3 hours. And so if you can't show up to work on time, that just throws everything off, but you have to get water, right? And so there's all these things that hold people back. And yeah, to me, one of the saddest parts is that how much time is lost from school, because that is the deposit that people need to make with their time when they're young to get educated so that they can have a more productive, fuller, healthier life. And that, to me, is kind of like one of the biggest, things that just rile you up.
Right.
that this burden is shifted.
Yeah.
Because we as a planet, we as government, we as whatever, can't seem to figure out how to get something so basic as water and sanitation to them.
You make such an apt point there about it being seemingly a very basic need.
Yeah.
And it amazes me that it's SDG 6, that it takes 5 other SDGs to get to the point that water is so fundamental to so many of these other aspects.
Yes.
And the kind of poverty trap means that education and making sure that women are empowered actually doesn't get you anywhere without having fundamental rights around water.
Yes.
I wonder, going back to the point about the water crisis being a market failure, could you tell me a little bit more about what you saw on the ground in terms of when did you personally see a shift in the issue? I mean, Water.org was founded 15 years
1990.
ago? Oh my God,
So,
making me feel old.
Yeah, well,
Okay.
Water Partners was 1990. I co-founded that, and then in 2009, we merged with Matt's organization, H2O Africa, and then rebranded it as Water.org at that point. Yeah.
Great. So I mean, you've been around in the industry since the end of the water decade, I think, as you mentioned in your book.
Even in the middle of the decade, I started, actually here in New York, I was working for an NGO called Catholic Relief Services right during the middle of the decade. So I was there, I got to oversee the final failure of the decade.
Wow. Okay. But could you explain what experiences you had that changed your perception? Because you mentioned at the very beginning, I think, that it became a charity issue and then it kind of transitioned away from that as you saw it more as a market failure. So what did that transition look like for you on the ground?
Yeah, I think it was just a lot of those aha moments, talking to women, you know, in their homes and in their communities, and seeing, actually when I was doing the research for my thesis in Tegucigalpa, Honduras, looking at the amount of time women spent walking and queuing for water and trying to understand why they made those trade-offs. And women were spending sometimes 25% of their income just to secure water for their family. And so I think that looking at how this played out over and over again and hearing these different stories from different women just started to build these insights about hearing about that woman and hearing about the one who was paying the loan shark, and then also hearing about the positive stories as well. People who had gotten access to water and how it kind of unleashed their economic potential. This was, in fact, it was a woman who got one of our water credit loans through one of our local partners in Uganda. And I think this story's in the book as well. She was an elderly woman, a grandmother, and she just went by the name of Mama Florence. And so Mama Florence, would get on her bicycle every day and ride to try to figure out where she could get water and fill up these water cans and bring them back. And so she took out, I think it was like a $275 loan that she then used to put a simple pump on a well beside her home. And once she did that, she had water that she could then grow a garden, and not only water for drinking, but she started to grow a garden, vegetables, kind of the waste from the vegetables she started feeding to the pigs to raise them and selling them. And then she started making bricks because she had this clay soil like right outside of her house, so she would make bricks and sell those. Then she started building some small rooms on her land where she could rent them out using the bricks. So you can just see it just, water as a way that just unleashes the entrepreneurial potential that we have. I mean, there's probably like some social entrepreneurs here, or entrepreneurs. I mean, imagine if like what's in the way of you pursuing your entrepreneurial spirit and dream is water, and how much that can set you free if that is what's lacking in your life. So it is just a collection of different experiences and understanding that like we just need to shift. We need to figure out how to drive more affordable loans and capital to people at the base of the pyramid, and to really not necessarily see the poor as a problem to be solved as it is really a market to be served. And along with seeing people in poverty as a market, I think it empowers them more. It makes them want to it empowers them to get the water and sanitation solution that they want, instead of an NGO coming in and doing it for them and drilling a well, a lot of which fail over time because it's not done with people, it's done for them. And we know that no one is going to take out a water or toilet loan for a solution that they don't want. And so the whole demand-driven nature of this makes a lot of sense as well. And so, treating people with the dignity that they deserve as customers, as opposed to, I'm here from the NGO, I'm going to solve your problem.
That is fascinating. You mentioned obviously some very interesting dynamics there that I think anyone who's worked in development will be familiar with, which is how can you go into a situation solving someone else's problem that was created by a whole score of problems that each of us have had a role in our own way. So you describe water as needing a breakthrough. Could you possibly explain a little bit more about what conditions of innovation you think would help to fix the water crisis?
Yeah, I mean, we get a lot of people coming to us with technologies that they think are game changers and silver bullets and things like that. And I I think that there can be potential in those. But to me, as an engineer myself, who I kind of like technology, I have 3 engineering degrees, but it's still, I see the innovation not as coming through, engineering and technology, although that can help. I see it coming more through financial innovation. And thinking of that is probably no surprise by this point in the conversation that I would think more about financial innovation and how do you innovate around that. And even just starting, with any problem you're trying to solve as an entrepreneur, an innovator, or, any kind of business that you're in, it's like first, examining the problem. And for me, when I was doing this from the perspective of, philanthropy and drilling wells, and then, I'd see our mission statement, we envision the day when everybody in the world, has a safe drink of water and the dignity of a toilet. And it's like, okay, we say this is the vision. What did we do today? Mm-hmm. What did we do last year? What are we going to do next year? And it looks like this, and the vision's up here. Then you can either kind of bury your head in the sand, or you can say, we got to rethink this. Mm. And I think having, what I call the suspension of disbelief, that there is a solution out there, you just have to find it, right? And at a visceral level, again, coming back to I knew that I had safe water and sanitation. I knew that virtually, everybody I know had it. It's like, it's not, we don't have to have like a medical research moonshot to do it. Then it's like, there has to be a solution, right? So then it's just a matter of looking at the problem where it exists and working backwards. Mm-hmm. And for me, all those encounters I had with women and looking at how they solve their water crisis every day, understanding it, and then the light bulb was like, that woman doesn't need me to drill a free well for her. She doesn't need charity. And so okay, so then how do we get the loan to her? And you clear that hurdle and work backwards. And then you realize the value that is being created for her. In the case of Lenoriza in the Philippines, that was massively more than what she was paying for that loan. It's like, there's a lot of value being created that maybe we can slice off part of that and pass it back up the chain. So maybe with the microfinance institutions that we're working with, they can get their piece of that value creation, and then they have to repay their lenders, and so on. And then we took it one step further, and I don't want to step on a question if you're going to water equity, but you come backwards on that chain and say, okay, so these microfinance institutions are telling us they need even more capital to get this done. And so you step back from that and you say, okay, so now you're bringing new kinds of money, not charity, into the system. But we still didn't make the final connection to the capital markets and impact investing that was here and in Europe. And that's when Matt and I were in a Jeep in India meeting with some of these partners, and they're all telling us the same thing: we need more capital. And Matt's like, we can find people in the United States if we can give them a small, financial return that would maybe lend to us and we could lend to them. And he's like, I'll put in the first $1 million and we'll launch a fund. And so then, you back the problem up to okay, we can find investors in the United States that will then begin to fuel this. And then all of a sudden you have faith when you poke your head out of the sand and say, maybe if we can connect the global capital markets to a woman making, a few dollars a day, the global capital markets are kind of theoretically infinite, right? And then you can start to say, okay, I feel good about doing this job every day because now I see daylight between what we are doing and the vision that we have. And so to me, that has been really the journey. There's 2 journeys in the book, really, or 2 stories in the book. It's the story of Matt and I kind of having these moments, but then, interspersed with that, certainly, it's the story of these heroic women who do solve this problem every day, however they can, and the story of those women who we're crossing paths with, that can work with one of the 150 financial partners we have around the world now, so that their story comes through in the book as well. The suffering that is there in the absence of this, but then also the potential that's unleashed. And that's what we're trying to communicate as best we can through the book.
Definitely. And there's also something much broader about what you mentioned here, which is that it's not for us to come in and solve the problem. The solution's already there. It's just putting the finance and the capital in the right hands so that those people can continue to solve the problem. And it's part of almost doing development differently, which is sort of an agenda that's come about to democratize the idea of who development is for. I wonder, you mentioned something very curious there about scaling. So obviously these problems and the solutions are kind of they're there already. They're there for us to discover. How do you see scaling in terms of the work you've been doing? Do you think microfinance is still the key to that?
I think it is, and more. As we, I mentioned we've done over $4 billion through our partners of these loans, and that has demonstrated a lot of pent-up demand from the bottom up, and people willing to bring capital from the bottom up at the household level. But then you also start getting into situations where, what if, a lot of this is because they are able to connect to the public utility. Well, what if the public utility doesn't have the pipes running into these neighborhoods? Oftentimes they do, and that's fairly easy to connect, but sometimes they don't. And so now what we're doing is we're going to launch a fund on infrastructure that will allow us to raise more social impact capital and then invest it in public and private utilities that can then expand the infrastructure. They can get more paying customers, and then they can repay those loans. And that will be loans that might also be equity stakes in some of these companies and utilities that are doing this. So to me, this is what we call water equity, the first fund that Matt invested in. We did $11 million of friends and family. We started doing that. I think we got maybe 1% financial return, but obviously huge social return in terms of people getting in water and sanitation. Then we moved up to a $50 million fund and got that done. And then we did a third fund and a fourth fund. We just closed a couple of weeks ago, and that fund is $150 million. So now we have water equity alongside of water.org. Water.org can continue to provide that technical assistance to help build the deal pipeline for the investments that can come through water equity. And so that's kind of the synergy we have, using philanthropic capital to kind of correct these market failures so that water equity can come along and invest and provide the opportunity for financial returns for investors. And so now water equity has about $350 million of committed capital through these funds that we can now deploy to reach more people. And then we'll be continuing along that trajectory of raising more capital to apply to SDG 6. And again, that allows us to get to investors that see this as a good opportunity.
Yeah,
at all levels, right? So.
Yeah, I think you mentioned some very transformative ideas there as well, not just for the water crisis, but also development more broadly, about how we can pull in seemingly very siloed private sector projects and ideas and bring these broader systems, which are so prevalent across our daily lives, into development, into the areas that you're working in. I'm conscious that we're almost at time, so I'll ask you a couple more questions. Just to move a little bit broader into now the Columbia community, you talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, actually at great length in your book, and about the role that the individuals who are going through water poverty are some of the best entrepreneurs that you've met. Because if you have a problem that affects you every day, you've really got to find a way of solving it. So what do you hope, we have 3 different schools in this room, nonprofit management, we've also got the climate school, and then also the School of International Public Affairs. What do you hope that both readers, but also people in this specific audience, will take away from the worth of water in the Columbia community?
Yeah, it's good question. I think I would see it on a couple of levels. One, in the context of the water and sanitation crisis, is that it is solvable. There's no reason why it can't be done. And we try to point out some of the examples in the book for ways to do that. And to me, I think everyone can take part in that. And I think either reading the book or we have a lot of donors who support water.org so that we can fuel this even more. So there's lots of ways, and even just being conscious. Water's not one of those things where you can if you save water here, you can't box it up and ship it there, right? It doesn't quite work that way. But just being conscious as you use water and kind of, being mentally, at least in solidarity with people, making you more predisposed to help in any way you can. So I think that's important. But I think the other, to extrapolate from that a little bit more is, if you are looking at, solving a big social problem, just keep digging, and keep asking questions and keep trying to understand, what I talk a lot about solving this in terms of concentric circles, like really understand the problem that you're trying to solve and then really understand each barrier, because as soon as you clear one of those barriers, there will be another one, but you keep going until you can finally get there. So I think that's that's not any big secret. I mean, that's what an entrepreneur does, right? And a social entrepreneur can do that just as well as somebody out there, seeking, venture capital out on Sand Hill Road. Those types of opportunities are there for anybody who thinks about the problem deeply, has tenacity, and, sticks to it.
Yeah. I love that we're leaving this on a note of positivity. I think we're going to welcome questions from the floor at this point. Just to sort of draw attention to the books at the back as well. So if people want to stay engaged with the issue and with Gary's work, then please feel free to pick one up.
Thank you both for such a compelling conversation. I'm Erwin De Leon. I'm a faculty member in the Nonprofit Management Program, and I'd like to invite the audience now to ask your questions, but please do so at that microphone over there. I think we should have time for 3 questions or so. So who'd like to start?
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I'd love to hear more about how in these local communities across the country, you're either working with the governments, or is it on their radar, they're trying to solve this problem and you're bringing an innovative solution, or are they sometimes challenging to work with, and just how that relationship plays out?
With government, yeah. So a few things. We have, one of the biggest programs we have has been in India. Probably about a third of our impact overall of that, 52 million people reached has been in India. And we have worked a lot with the Modi administration there in terms of their total sanitation program. So Prime Minister Modi set this vision that everybody in India would have a toilet and end open defecation. And they had realized that they can only put so much money into that in terms of subsidies, and we were already scaling up water credit, and people, half the people that were taking out loans under water credit with our local partners were using it for toilets. And so they kind of took our model, and we didn't want our name on it, didn't have to be our name, but they kind of took the model and how it worked and got the word out through the different states so that could scale up. So definitely collaborated with them, and doing that now with piped water as well. And I was just reading in the New York Times just 2 days ago how at the start of the Modi administration, 80% of the people in India were practicing open defecation. Now it's down to 21%. So I'd like to think that we had a little bit of help in there. Obviously, there was people doing a lot more than us, but just introducing the concept that not everybody had to get a free toilet, that a lot of people could do that. And a lot of people, there was also a bottleneck in that for some states you couldn't get, you could only get reimbursed for your toilet once you proved that it was built. And so you're still in this trap, you don't have the money up front. So a lot of people would take out loans from our partners, build the toilet, certify it, and then they would get reimbursed. So that happened a lot as well. Another thing that we're looking at with infrastructure is, because a lot of countries aren't able to meet the needs through their utilities, or they're in secondary cities, smaller municipalities, they'll provide, they'll have a concession so that a private company, if they're willing to invest, will come in and design and build the infrastructure, and then it can get transferred to the government to operate. And so a lot of those companies that want to do that don't have the capital that they need, because they're kind of small entrepreneurs sometimes themselves. So we're looking at investing in growth companies that would then do that as well. And again, for governments that don't have the cash up front, it can be a good solution.
Next. Please, go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much for your talk. Sort of curious to hear a bit about how, when you move to operate into a new region or a new country, what sort of challenges do you have as an organization, like getting feet on the ground or getting connected or building out sort of your team and your operations and your connections there?
Yeah, no, it can be challenging. And what we look for is one, what is the level of poverty of the country, and then within the country, what are the populations that are living in poverty, and making sure that we can have a program that hits those demographics that we want. So that's a big part. Understanding how the financial system works there and how open and the regulatory market is for microfinance and other financial institutions to lend for something like this. With water equity, we're actually bringing capital in and have to repatriate it, as the work progresses and the repayments get made. So we have to make sure that the regulatory environment doesn't get us, stranding assets in a country. So we have to look at all of those things. But the thing that we don't do is hire a bunch of U.S. folks and ship them off to the countries to do this. So I think, with the exception of one person in the whole globe, everybody is a local national of the regions where we're operating. And so, it is, you do have to exert some effort to kind of get the first hires, but then you can have those functions distributed, regionally for HR and other things to kind of then hire the next cadre of people. So.
That's great. I think we should have time for at least one more question. Or are we ready for the reception? Going? Well, thank you both.
Yes.
Wonderful conversation, and thank you for everyone who came. And please stay and enjoy the reception.
Okay.